Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly, the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sexuality. It was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies, a time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one's watching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through a world where romance was complicated, privacy was optional, and passion had to navigate around some very stern religious authorities. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval intimacy. It did not unfold beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family, including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered. So did volume. And ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury, beds were shared, and even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed or standing in the corner pretending not to notice anything. Many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right. Total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You'd better check if there's already someone in the bed, and whether or not they brought their boots. If you were married and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you weren't married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip traveled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. The physical environment of medieval intimacy was challenging in ways that modern people can barely imagine. The typical peasant home was a single room with a dirt floor, thatched roof, and walls made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks and mud. The smell was a complex bouquet of smoke, animals, unwashed bodies, and whatever was rotting in the corner that week. Beds, when they existed, were usually nothing more than straw-filled sacks on wooden frames. The straw was changed infrequently, if at all, and often harbored fleas, lice, and other unwelcome guests. The scratchy, poking sensation of old straw was just another romantic obstacle to navigate around. Lighting was provided by candles, oil lamps, or the dying embers of the cooking fire. This created an atmosphere that was either romantically dim or frustratingly dark, depending on your perspective. The flickering light cast dancing shadows that could be either mysterious or simply annoying when you were trying to accomplish something that required coordination. Temperature control was non-existent. In winter, couples had to choose between freezing or risking setting their straw bedding on fire by bringing the brazier too close. In summer, the combination of body heat, heavy clothing, and poor ventilation could make intimate moments feel more like endurance tests than expressions of love. The sounds of medieval life provided a constant soundtrack that was rarely conducive to romance. Animals snorted and shuffled, children cried, adults snored, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Any attempt at intimate conversation had to compete with this cacophony of daily life. Hygiene was another significant challenge. Regular bathing was rare, and when it did occur, it was often a communal activity that offered little privacy. Most people cleaned themselves with cold water and rough cloths, if they cleaned themselves at all. The result was that intimate encounters often involved navigating around various unpleasant odors and textures. Clothing presented its own obstacles. Medieval garments were complex, layered, and often secured with numerous ties, pins, and fastenings. Removing clothing was a time-consuming process that required patience and often assistance. The heavy fabrics and multiple layers meant that partial undressing was often the most practical option. The social expectations surrounding intimate behavior were strict and well-defined. Couples were expected to conduct themselves with modesty and restraint, even in private. Excessive passion or enthusiasm was viewed with suspicion and could lead to accusations of sinfulness or moral corruption. Despite these challenges, medieval couples found ways to express their affection and desire. They developed subtle signals and codes that allowed them to communicate their intentions without attracting unwanted attention. They learned to make the most of brief moments of privacy and to find intimacy in small gestures and quiet conversations. The creativity required to maintain romantic relationships under these conditions was remarkable. Couples had to be resourceful, patient, and discreet. They had to balance their natural desires with social expectations and practical limitations. In many ways, the constraints of medieval life made successful romantic relationships more precious and meaningful than they might be in easier circumstances. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else was distracting at best, sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable, in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent? Also no. That left maybe Tuesdays in April. Even within marriage, there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but not excessive. Displays of passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One 13th century guide suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was missionary, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like enthusiasm. Confession also got involved. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries. They were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. The theological reasoning behind these restrictions was complex and often contradictory. The Church taught that sexual desire was a consequence of original sin, a corruption of humanity's original pure state. However, it also recognized that sexual activity was necessary for procreation and the continuation of the human race. This created a fundamental tension that church authorities struggled to resolve. The concept of conjugal debt was central to medieval church teaching about marital sexuality. This doctrine held that married couples owed each other sexual availability and that refusing one's spouse without good reason was sinful. However, this obligation was hedged with numerous restrictions and qualifications that made it difficult to fulfill without risking spiritual contamination. The Church's calendar of prohibited times was extensive and detailed. In addition to the major liturgical seasons, couples were expected to abstain during women's menstrual periods, during pregnancy, while nursing, and for extended periods before and after childbirth. When all these restrictions were added up, the number of days when marital intimacy was considered acceptable was surprisingly small. The enforcement of these rules varied dramatically depending on location, social class, and the individual priest's interpretation of church law. Urban parishes with educated clergy might enforce the rules strictly, while rural areas with less supervision might be more lenient. Wealthy families with private chaplains faced more scrutiny than poor peasants who rarely saw a priest. The penitential literature of the medieval period provides detailed insight into church attitudes toward sexuality. These manuals for confessors listed various sexual sins and their appropriate punishments, ranging from brief fasts to years of penance. The specificity of these lists suggests that medieval people were engaging in a wide variety of sexual behaviors, despite official disapproval. The Church's teachings on sexual pleasure were particularly complex. While pleasure was generally viewed with suspicion, some theologians argued that moderate pleasure within marriage was acceptable as long as it didn't become the primary motivation for sexual activity. This created a fine line that couples had to navigate carefully to avoid sin. The role of women in medieval church teachings about sexuality was particularly restrictive. Women were seen as both the source of sexual temptation and the victims of male desire. They were expected to be passive participants in sexual activity and were held responsible for controlling male lust through their behavior and appearance. The Church's influence on medieval sexuality extended beyond married couples to include detailed regulations about courtship, engagement, and wedding ceremonies. The process of forming a valid marriage was carefully controlled to ensure that sexual activity occurred only within properly sanctioned relationships. Despite the Church's extensive regulations, there is evidence that many medieval people found ways to work around or ignore the official teachings. Love letters, poetry, and artistic works from the period suggest that passion and pleasure were important parts of many relationships, regardless of official disapproval. The medical theories of the time often conflicted with church teachings, creating additional confusion for medieval couples. Physicians argued that sexual activity was necessary for health and that abstinence could cause illness. This medical advice often contradicted religious teachings, leaving couples to choose between spiritual and physical well-being. The Church's teachings on sexuality also had significant political implications. The regulation of sexual behavior was seen as essential for maintaining social order and preventing the chaos that was believed to result from uncontrolled passion. Sexual sins were often viewed as threats to the stability of society as a whole. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of Saint Valentine himself, who, ironically, was never married. The Church had opinions, and by opinions we mean strict prohibitions, on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays? Still no day of penance. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Add in Lent, 40 days. Advent, another 40. Various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases. And you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even lists, actual lists, of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, weather, and not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of Saint Nunburga the Perpetually Chaste. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or, worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbors caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. The complexity of the medieval liturgical calendar made compliance with these restrictions extremely difficult for ordinary people. The church year was filled with overlapping cycles of feast days, fast days, and penitential seasons that could change from year to year depending on the date of Easter and other movable feasts. Local saints' days added another layer of complexity to the calendar of restrictions. Each region had its own patron saints and local observances that carried their own prohibitions. A couple might think they had found a permissible day, only to discover that it was the feast of some obscure local martyr who required sexual abstinence. The seasonal restrictions were particularly burdensome. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, was a time of fasting and penance when sexual activity was strictly forbidden. Advent, the period before Christmas, carried similar restrictions. These two seasons alone eliminated nearly 3 months of the year from the calendar of permissible intimacy. The weekly cycle of restrictions was equally challenging. Fridays were forbidden as days of penance commemorating Christ's crucifixion. Sundays were off-limits as days of rest and worship. Wednesdays were often included as additional fast days. This left only 4 days of the week when intimacy might be acceptable, and even those were subject to other restrictions. The menstrual cycle added another layer of prohibition. Women were considered ritually unclean during their monthly periods, and for several days afterward. This biological reality, combined with the Church's teachings about ritual purity, eliminated additional days from the already limited calendar of permissible intimacy. Pregnancy and childbirth brought their own restrictions. Sexual activity was forbidden during pregnancy to protect the developing child, and for extended periods after birth, while the mother was considered impure. Given the frequency of pregnancy in medieval families, these restrictions could eliminate months or even years from a couple's intimate life. The enforcement of calendar restrictions varied widely depending on the vigilance of local clergy and the social status of the couples involved. Wealthy families with private chaplains faced constant scrutiny, while poor peasants in remote areas might go months without seeing a priest who could enforce the rules. Some couples attempted to work around the restrictions by seeking special dispensations from church authorities. These requests were rarely granted and often resulted in additional scrutiny and penance. The Church was generally unsympathetic to arguments based on personal desire or marital happiness. The psychological impact of these calendar restrictions was significant. Couples lived in constant fear of accidentally violating the rules and committing sin. The complexity of the restrictions meant that even well-intentioned couples could easily make mistakes and find themselves in need of confession and penance. The medical community of the time often disagreed with the Church's calendar restrictions. Physicians argued that regular sexual activity was necessary for health and that prolonged abstinence could cause physical and mental illness. This conflict between medical and religious advice created additional stress for medieval couples. Despite the extensive restrictions, there is evidence that many couples found ways to maintain intimate relationships throughout the year. Love letters and personal documents from the period suggest that passion often overcame piety, though usually with considerable guilt and anxiety about the spiritual consequences. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you'd be better off reading a troubadour ballad. Real-life courtship, for most people, involved livestock, land rights, and two families agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbors who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Courtship, when it happened, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely caught alone time. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later, or not at all. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Romantic. Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled. A man's suitability was judged by his land, tools, or the size of his ox. Women? They were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and general ability to not start drama at the market. This doesn't mean love didn't exist. It did. But it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Still, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful. Get caught kissing behind the barn, and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father with a pitchfork. The rituals of medieval courtship were elaborate and highly codified, especially among the upper classes. The concept of courtly love, popularized by troubadours and poets, created an idealized version of romance that bore little resemblance to the practical realities of most people's lives. This literary tradition emphasized devotion, suffering, and unattainable desire, themes that were more suitable for poetry than for actual relationships. The role of intermediaries in medieval courtship was crucial. Marriages were typically negotiated by parents, guardians, or professional matchmakers who understood the complex web of family alliances, property rights, and social obligations that governed medieval society. These negotiations could take months or even years to complete, with the actual couple having little input into the process. The exchange of gifts during courtship served both romantic and practical purposes. A suitor might present his intended with jewelry, clothing, or other valuable items that demonstrated his wealth and serious intentions. These gifts also served as a form of insurance. If the engagement was broken, the gifts usually had to be returned, creating financial incentives for both parties to honor their commitments. The physical aspects of medieval courtship were strictly regulated and closely monitored. Physical contact between unmarried couples was generally forbidden, with even holding hands considered inappropriate in many contexts. This created a highly charged atmosphere where the smallest gestures, a lingering glance, a brief touch of fingers, carried enormous significance. The language of medieval courtship was rich with symbolism and coded meanings. Flowers, colors, and even the way clothing was worn could convey messages between potential lovers. A woman might wear a particular color to signal her availability, while a man might choose specific flowers to communicate his intentions. These subtle forms of communication allowed couples to express their feelings while maintaining the appearance of propriety. The role of music and poetry in medieval courtship cannot be overstated. Troubadours and minstrels created a vast repertoire of love songs that provided both entertainment and instruction in the art of romance. These songs often told stories of idealized love that served as models for real-life courtship, though the reality was usually far less dramatic than the poetry suggested. The seasonal nature of medieval life affected courtship patterns significantly. Spring and summer were the preferred times for weddings, as the warmer weather made celebrations more pleasant and the agricultural calendar allowed for time away from essential work. This created a rhythm of courtship that followed the natural cycles of the year. The economic aspects of medieval courtship were complex and often determining factors in the success or failure of relationships. The size of a dowry, the value of landholdings, and the potential for future inheritance all played crucial roles in matchmaking decisions. Love might grow between couples, but financial compatibility was essential for survival. The legal framework surrounding medieval courtship was intricate and varied by region. The Church's requirements for valid marriages, local customs regarding betrothal, and royal or noble oversight of aristocratic matches all created a complex web of regulations that couples had to navigate. Failure to follow proper procedures could result in invalid marriages and serious legal consequences. The role of physical appearance in medieval courtship was significant, but different from modern standards. While beauty was certainly appreciated, other factors such as health, fertility, and social status were often more important. The ability to bear children and manage a household was valued more highly than physical attractiveness in most practical arrangements. The duration of medieval courtships varied widely depending on social class and circumstances. Peasant couples might have brief courtships lasting only a few weeks, while noble marriages could involve years of negotiation and preparation. The complexity of the arrangements often determined the timeline more than the feelings of the individuals involved. The privacy available to courting couples was extremely limited, creating unique challenges for developing emotional intimacy. Most interactions took place in public or semi-public settings, with family members or servants present to ensure propriety. This lack of privacy meant that couples had to develop relationships through subtle communication and shared activities rather than private conversations. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax. And there are scattered references to, let's call them, medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labeled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. The herbal contraceptives used in medieval times were based on centuries of folk knowledge passed down through generations of women. Plants like pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were commonly used, often brewed into teas or applied as pessaries. While some of these herbs did have contraceptive properties, they were also highly toxic and could cause serious illness or death if used incorrectly. The preparation and use of herbal contraceptives was typically the domain of older women who had accumulated knowledge through experience. These informal practitioners, sometimes called wise women, served as the primary source of reproductive health information for their communities. Their knowledge was passed down orally and varied significantly from region to region. The effectiveness of medieval contraceptive methods was generally poor, but not entirely without merit. Some barrier methods, such as pessaries made from various materials, could provide limited protection. However, the lack of understanding about reproductive biology meant that even potentially effective methods were often used incorrectly or at the wrong times. The social consequences of contraceptive use were severe in many communities. Women who were known to use contraceptives might be accused of witchcraft or moral corruption. The association between contraception and sin made it a dangerous practice that had to be conducted in secret, limiting the sharing of knowledge and improving techniques. The economic factors that drove contraceptive use were significant. Large families were expensive to maintain, and in times of scarcity, additional children could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The economic pressure to limit family size often outweighed religious prohibitions, leading many couples to take risks with dangerous contraceptive methods. The male role in medieval contraception was generally limited, but not entirely absent. Some methods, such as withdrawal, required male cooperation and self-control. However, the burden of contraception typically fell on women, who faced the greatest consequences if methods failed and pregnancy resulted. The timing methods used in medieval contraception were based on incomplete understanding of the female reproductive cycle. While some women attempted to track their cycles and avoid intercourse during fertile periods, the lack of accurate knowledge about ovulation made these methods largely ineffective. The magical and superstitious aspects of medieval contraception were extensive. Amulets, charms, and rituals were commonly used alongside or instead of physical methods. While these approaches had no actual contraceptive effect, They provided psychological comfort and a sense of control over reproduction. The international trade in contraceptive ingredients created networks of knowledge and materials that spanned medieval Europe. Exotic herbs and substances were imported from distant regions, often at great expense, based on their reputation for preventing pregnancy. This trade also facilitated the exchange of contraceptive knowledge between different cultures. The legal status of contraception varied by region and time period. While the Church consistently opposed contraceptive use, secular authorities were often more concerned with practical matters such as population growth and economic stability. Some regions had laws regulating the sale of contraceptive herbs, while others ignored the practice entirely. The failure rates of medieval contraceptive methods were high, leading to frequent unintended pregnancies. When contraception failed, couples faced difficult choices about whether to continue the pregnancy, seek abortion, which was dangerous and often illegal, or arrange hasty marriages to legitimize the birth. The documentation of medieval contraceptive practices is limited, as these activities were often conducted in secret and rarely recorded in official documents. Most of our knowledge comes from medical texts, religious condemnations, and legal records of prosecutions, which may not accurately represent the full range of practices used by ordinary people. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except, not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailor advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing, which makes sense, because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative, and nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators. And any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." The origins of the chastity belt myth can be traced to several sources, none of which provide credible evidence for their widespread use in medieval times. Some Renaissance-era satirical works depicted chastity belts as symbols of male jealousy and female oppression, but these were clearly intended as social commentary rather than historical documentation. The Victorian fascination with medieval barbarism led to the creation of many fake medieval artifacts, including chastity belts. Victorian collectors and museum curators, eager to demonstrate the progress of civilization, often commissioned or purchased items that confirmed their preconceptions about the Dark Ages. These fabricated artifacts then became part of the historical record, perpetuating the myth. The practical problems with chastity belts would have made them nearly impossible to use for extended periods. The human body requires regular cleaning and maintenance, particularly in intimate areas. A metal device that prevented access to these areas would quickly become a source of serious infection and health problems. Medieval people, despite their limited understanding of hygiene, would have recognized these dangers. The economic aspects of chastity belt production would have made them prohibitively expensive for most people. The metalworking skills required to create a functional belt would have been considerable, and the cost would have put them beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest families. There is no evidence of a chastity belt industry or specialized craftsmen who produce these items. The social implications of chastity belt use would have been enormous and highly visible. If such devices were commonly used, they would have appeared in literature, art, legal documents, and religious texts. The absence of such references in medieval sources is strong evidence that chastity belts were not a significant part of medieval life. The medical knowledge of medieval physicians would have made them aware of the health risks associated with chastity belts. Medical texts from the period discuss various gynecological issues and treatments, but there is no mention of problems or treatments related to chastity belt use. This absence is particularly significant given the detailed nature of medieval medical literature. The legal framework of medieval society would have required some regulation of chastity belts if they were commonly used. Marriage laws, property rights, and personal liberty would all have been affected by the use of such devices. The absence of legal references to chastity belts suggests that they were not a recognized part of medieval legal or social practice. The religious attitudes toward chastity belts would likely have been negative. The Church emphasized the importance of free will in moral choices, and would have been suspicious of mechanical devices that enforced virtue. The absence of religious commentary on chastity belts, either positive or negative, suggests that they were not a significant issue for medieval religious authorities. The archaeological evidence for chastity belts is extremely limited and problematic. The few examples that exist are of questionable provenance and dating. Many supposed medieval chastity belts have been shown to be later creations, often made for museums or private collectors who wanted to own medieval artifacts. The feminist interpretations of the chastity belt myth have focused on its symbolic value as a representation of male control over female sexuality. While this symbolism is powerful and relevant to discussions of gender relations, it should not be confused with historical fact. The myth of the chastity belt may tell us more about later attitudes toward medieval women than about medieval reality. The persistence of the chastity belt myth in popular culture demonstrates the power of compelling narratives to override historical evidence. The image of the locked and controlled medieval woman fits with broader stereotypes about the Dark Ages and continues to influence popular understanding of medieval life despite the lack of supporting evidence. The debunking of the chastity belt myth is part of a broader effort by medieval historians to correct misconceptions about the period. This work involves not only disproving false claims but also presenting a more accurate and nuanced picture of medieval life, including the real ways in which sexuality and relationships were regulated and controlled. In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centers, brothels operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colorfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice. But unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks, yes, actual handbooks, for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes, knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were cataloged, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval tinder, it was not. The regulation of medieval brothels was surprisingly sophisticated and varied significantly from city to city. In some places, like Avignon during the papal residence, brothels were strictly controlled and heavily taxed. The city fathers saw them as a source of revenue and a way to maintain social order by providing an outlet for male sexual desires that might otherwise disrupt marriages and families. The licensing system for brothels often included detailed requirements about location, operation, and management. Brothels were typically required to be located in specific areas of the city, away from churches and schools but accessible to potential customers. The buildings had to meet certain standards for cleanliness and safety, and the operators had to pay regular fees to maintain their licenses. The women who worked in medieval brothels came from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Some were widows who had few other economic options after losing their husbands. Others were young women from poor families who saw sex work as a way to earn money and potentially improve their social status. Still, others were victims of trafficking or coercion, forced into the profession against their will. The economic structure of medieval brothels was complex and often exploitative. The women typically had to pay fees to the brothel keeper for room, board, and protection. They also had to pay taxes to the city and sometimes to the church. After all these deductions, the amount of money they actually kept was often quite small, making it difficult to save enough to leave the profession. The health and safety conditions in medieval brothels were generally poor by modern standards, but they were often better regulated than other aspects of medieval life. Some cities required regular health inspections and mandated that brothel keepers provide clean bedding and basic medical care. However, the understanding of sexually transmitted diseases was limited, and effective treatments were largely unavailable. The clientele of medieval brothels was diverse and included men from all social classes: merchants traveling on business, young apprentices, married men seeking variety, and even clergy were known to frequent these establishments. The prices were typically scaled according to the customer's ability to pay, with wealthy clients charged more for the same services. The relationship between medieval brothels and the church was complex and often hypocritical. While the church officially condemned prostitution as sinful, many religious authorities recognized its practical necessity and were willing to tolerate regulated brothels as a lesser evil. Some monasteries and churches even owned property that was rented to brothel operators, creating a direct financial interest in the trade. The legal status of prostitution varied significantly across medieval Europe. In some regions, it was completely illegal and harshly punished. In others, it was tolerated or even regulated by law. The differences often reflected local economic conditions, religious influences, and political considerations rather than consistent moral principles. The social stigma associated with prostitution was significant but not absolute. While sex workers were generally looked down upon by respectable society, they were not necessarily outcasts. Some successful prostitutes were able to accumulate wealth and property, and a few even married into respectable families after leaving the profession. The international aspects of medieval prostitution were significant, particularly in port cities and trading centers. Women were often trafficked across borders, and the demand for exotic or foreign women created international networks of sexual commerce. These networks were often connected to other forms of trade and commerce, making them difficult to regulate or control. The seasonal patterns of medieval prostitution reflected the rhythms of medieval economic life. Demand was typically higher during harvest seasons, trade fairs, and religious festivals, when men had more money to spend and were away from their families. The winter months were often slower, creating economic hardship for sex workers who depended on regular income. The decline of regulated medieval prostitution came gradually, as changing religious attitudes, new moral reform movements, and evolving legal systems made the practice less acceptable. However, the transition was uneven, and some forms of regulated prostitution continued well into the early modern period in certain regions. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: hygiene. Specifically, what it smelled like when those ruby lips parted to speak words of courtly love. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened to reveal the aromatic reality within. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspirational concept, and minty freshness wasn't invented yet, unless you count standing near an herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable, even if achieving it was about as likely as finding a unicorn in your stable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically, you probably had. The reality was that most people's breath could knock a horse unconscious at 20 paces, but social conventions required everyone to pretend otherwise. Medieval women did what they could with the limited resources available to them. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally twigs, not just for the taste, but to keep their mouths tolerable enough for close conversation. Think of it as the pre-mint version of gum, except it didn't freshen your breath so much as temporarily mask the underlying aroma of decay and desperation. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These concoctions were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. The goal was subtle improvement, not obvious dental maintenance. Toothbrushing, as we know it today, wasn't standard practice. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small, fibrous twigs that could scrub the teeth and double as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. The effectiveness of these methods was questionable at best, and the potential for injury was considerable. The bathing situation was equally challenging for romantic encounters. While the stereotype of medieval people never bathing is exaggerated, regular washing was certainly not the norm. Most people cleaned themselves with cold water and rough cloths, if they cleaned themselves at all. Hot baths were a luxury reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions like weddings or religious festivals. The lack of understanding about the connection between cleanliness and health meant that many people saw bathing as potentially dangerous. Some believed that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Others thought that the layer of dirt and oil on the skin provided protection against illness. These beliefs, combined with the practical difficulties of heating water and finding privacy, made regular bathing uncommon. The clothing worn during intimate encounters presented additional hygiene challenges. Medieval garments were made from wool, linen, and other natural fibers that absorbed odors and were difficult to clean. Most people owned only a few sets of clothing, which they wore repeatedly without washing. The result was that even freshly bathed individuals might still carry the accumulated sense of daily life in their clothing. The use of perfumes and scented oils was one way that medieval people attempted to address hygiene issues. However, these products were expensive and often ineffective at masking strong body odors. The wealthy could afford imported perfumes and exotic scents, while the poor made do with local herbs and flowers. The result was often a complex mixture of natural body odors, perfumes, and environmental scents that could be overwhelming in close quarters. The seasonal variations in hygiene were significant and affected intimate relationships. In winter, when bathing was most difficult and uncomfortable, people tended to accumulate more dirt and odors. The heavy clothing required for warmth also trapped scents and made cleaning more challenging. Summer brought its own problems as increased sweating and outdoor activities created new hygiene challenges. The social expectations around hygiene varied by class and region. The nobility were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness and often employed servants to help with bathing and grooming. However, even among the upper classes, daily bathing was rare, and the standards of cleanliness were far below modern expectations. The medical understanding of hygiene was limited and often counterproductive. Many physicians believed that certain odors were signs of health and vitality, while others thought that excessive cleanliness could weaken the body's natural defenses. These beliefs influenced personal hygiene practices and made it difficult for people to make informed decisions about cleanliness. The religious attitudes toward hygiene were complex and sometimes contradictory. Some religious authorities emphasized the importance of cleanliness as a sign of spiritual purity, while others viewed excessive attention to the body as vanity and sin. These conflicting messages created confusion about the appropriate level of personal hygiene for devout Christians. The practical challenges of maintaining hygiene in medieval living conditions were enormous. Most homes lacked running water, proper drainage, or adequate ventilation. The close quarters in which most people lived made privacy for bathing difficult, and the lack of soap and other cleaning products made effective washing challenging even when water was available. Medieval marriage wasn't just about love, companionship, or even basic compatibility. It was a complex political and economic arrangement that affected entire families, communities, and sometimes kingdoms. The bedroom, far from being a private sanctuary, was often the most scrutinized and regulated space in a medieval household, where personal desires had to navigate around family expectations, religious requirements, and social obligations. The concept of marital duty was central to medieval marriage, but it was far more complicated than simple obligation. Both husbands and wives had specific roles and expectations that were carefully defined by law, custom, and religious teaching. The wife was expected to be obedient, fertile, and chaste, while the husband was expected to be protective, providing, and faithful, though the definition of faithfulness was often more flexible for men than for women. The negotiation of intimate relationships within marriage required considerable skill and diplomacy. Couples had to balance their personal desires with social expectations, religious requirements, and family pressures. The bedroom became a space where power dynamics were constantly negotiated and renegotiated, often with significant consequences for the broader relationship and family structure. The role of fertility in medieval marriage cannot be overstated. The ability to produce children, particularly male heirs, was often the primary measure of a marriage's success. This created enormous pressure on both partners, but especially on women, who were typically blamed if pregnancies did not occur or if children died in infancy. The bedroom became a site of anxiety and performance pressure that could strain even loving relationships. The economic aspects of medieval marriage extended into the most intimate aspects of the relationship. The dowry that a woman brought to marriage, the property that a man contributed, and the potential inheritance that children might receive all influenced the dynamics of marital intimacy. Couples had to consider not just their personal feelings, but also the economic implications of their reproductive choices. The legal framework surrounding medieval marriage gave husbands considerable authority over their wives' bodies and reproductive choices. Women had limited rights to refuse their husbands' sexual demands, and the concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law. However, the reality was often more complex, as women found various ways to exercise agency and influence within the constraints of the legal system. The role of extended family in medieval marriage meant that intimate relationships were rarely truly private. Parents, siblings, and other relatives often had opinions about and influence over marital relationships. The bedroom might be physically private, but the decisions made there had public consequences that affected the entire family network. The religious oversight of medieval marriage extended into the most intimate aspects of the relationship. Priests and confessors regularly inquired about marital relations, offering guidance and sometimes criticism about couples' intimate lives. This religious supervision created additional pressure and anxiety around sexual relationships within marriage. The social expectations for different classes created varying standards for marital intimacy. Noble couples were expected to maintain dignity and restraint even in private, while peasant couples had more freedom but also more practical constraints. These class differences affected everything from the physical setting of intimate encounters to the emotional expectations of the relationship. The age differences common in medieval marriages created unique dynamics in intimate relationships. Many marriages involved significant age gaps, with older men marrying much younger women. These relationships required careful negotiation of power and authority, as well as accommodation of different levels of experience and maturity. The health considerations that affected medieval intimate relationships were significant but poorly understood. The lack of effective contraception, limited medical knowledge about reproductive health, and high rates of maternal and infant mortality all created challenges for couples trying to maintain healthy intimate relationships while managing the risks of pregnancy and childbirth. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life affected marital intimacy in ways that modern couples rarely experience. Agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and weather patterns all influenced when and how couples could be intimate. The bedroom became a space that had to accommodate these external rhythms while still serving the personal needs of the relationship. The privacy challenges of medieval living arrangements meant that marital intimacy often had to be conducted with great discretion and creativity. The presence of servants, children, and other family members in close quarters required couples to develop subtle communication and timing skills to maintain their intimate relationships while preserving social propriety. Pregnancy in medieval times wasn't just a 9-month journey toward parenthood. It was a perilous adventure that could end in triumph, tragedy, or something uncomfortably in between. From the moment conception was suspected until well after birth, medieval women navigated a world of superstition, limited medical knowledge, and social expectations that could be as dangerous as they were demanding. The detection of pregnancy in medieval times relied on a combination of physical symptoms, folk wisdom, and occasionally bizarre tests. One popular method involved having a woman urinate on barley and wheat seeds. If they sprouted, she was pregnant, and the type of grain that grew first supposedly indicated the baby's gender. While this sounds ridiculous, modern research suggests it may have had some accuracy due to hormonal changes affecting plant growth. Other pregnancy tests were less scientific and more wishful thinking. Some involved examining the color and consistency of urine, while others required complex interpretations of dreams, changes in appetite, or the behavior of household animals. The lack of reliable pregnancy tests meant that women often remained uncertain about their condition for months, making it difficult to plan for the physical and social changes ahead. Once pregnancy was confirmed or strongly suspected, medieval women entered a world of restrictions, recommendations, and rituals designed to ensure a successful birth. The advice they received was a mixture of practical wisdom, religious guidance, and complete nonsense, often delivered with equal authority and conviction. Dietary recommendations for pregnant women were extensive and often contradictory. Some foods were believed to influence the baby's appearance, temperament, or gender, while others were thought to cause miscarriage or birth defects. Pregnant women were often advised to avoid certain meats, spices, or vegetables, while consuming others in specific quantities or preparations. The result was a complex and often restrictive diet that may have done more harm than good. The physical activities permitted to pregnant women were carefully regulated by family members, medical authorities, and social convention. Heavy lifting, vigorous exercise, and even excessive walking were often forbidden, based on the belief that physical exertion could harm the developing baby. However, complete bed rest was also discouraged, as it was thought to weaken the mother and make birth more difficult. The emotional and psychological aspects of medieval pregnancy were heavily influenced by religious and cultural beliefs about women's roles and capabilities. Pregnant women were often seen as both blessed and cursed, carrying new life, but also bearing the burden of Eve's sin. This created a complex emotional environment where joy and anxiety were closely intertwined. The medical care available to pregnant women varied dramatically based on social class, geographic location, and local customs. Wealthy women might have access to trained physicians and experienced midwives, while poor women relied on family members and local wise women with varying levels of knowledge and skill. The quality of care could mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. The superstitions surrounding pregnancy were numerous and often elaborate. Pregnant women were advised to avoid looking at certain animals, hearing specific sounds, or witnessing particular events that might mark their unborn children. These beliefs created a constant state of vigilance and anxiety, as women tried to control every aspect of their environment to ensure their baby's health and appearance. The social isolation that often accompanied medieval pregnancy was both protective and limiting. Pregnant women, especially in the later stages, were often confined to their homes and limited in their social interactions. This isolation was intended to protect both mother and child from harmful influences, but it also cut women off from support networks and normal social activities. The preparation for childbirth began early in pregnancy and involved both practical and spiritual elements. Women gathered supplies, arranged for assistance, and often made religious vows or pilgrimages to ensure divine protection during labor. The uncertainty of medieval childbirth made these preparations feel like preparations for battle, which in many ways they were. The economic implications of pregnancy were significant for medieval families. The cost of medical care, special foods, and preparations for the baby could strain family resources. At the same time, the potential loss of the woman's labor during pregnancy and recovery could create additional financial hardship, especially for poor families who depended on every member's contribution. The legal status of pregnant women was complex and often disadvantageous. Pregnant women had limited rights and were often subject to additional restrictions and oversight. Their legal capacity was often diminished, and their ability to make decisions about their own care and circumstances was frequently limited by male relatives or authorities. The mortality rates associated with medieval pregnancy and childbirth were high, creating a constant awareness of danger that affected every aspect of the experience. Women knew that pregnancy could be a death sentence, and this knowledge influenced their relationships, their spiritual practices, and their approach to daily life throughout the pregnancy. When it came time for medieval women to give birth, they entered a world that was almost exclusively female, governed by traditions passed down through generations of women who had learned through experience what worked, what didn't, and what might kill you. The midwife was the central figure in this world, part medical practitioner, part spiritual guide, part crisis manager, and occasionally part miracle worker. Medieval midwives were typically older women who had given birth themselves and had learned their craft through apprenticeship with experienced practitioners. They possessed a combination of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and spiritual practices that had been refined over centuries. While they lacked formal medical training in the modern sense, many were highly skilled and experienced in managing the complexities of childbirth. The training of medieval midwives was informal but intensive. Young women who showed aptitude and interest would be taken under the wing of established midwives, learning through observation and gradually taking on more responsibility. This apprenticeship system ensured that knowledge was passed down through generations, though it also meant that incorrect practices could be perpetuated alongside useful ones. The tools and techniques available to medieval midwives were limited, but often ingenious. They used various herbs to ease pain, encourage labor, or stop bleeding. Birthing chairs and stools were designed to help women deliver in positions that worked with gravity. Massage, positioning, and emotional support were all part of the midwife's arsenal, along with prayers, charms, and rituals believed to provide spiritual protection. The social status of midwives was complex and varied by region and time period. In some communities, they were highly respected figures who held important positions in the social hierarchy. In others, they were viewed with suspicion, particularly by church authorities who were concerned about their use of herbal remedies and folk practices that might be considered magical or pagan. The relationship between midwives and the church was often tense and complicated. While the church recognized the necessity of midwives for safe childbirth, it was suspicious of their traditional practices and their independence from male authority. Some regions required midwives to be licensed by church authorities and to swear oaths that they would not use forbidden practices or remedies. The economic aspects of midwifery varied significantly. In wealthy households, midwives might be well compensated for their services and might even be retained on a regular basis. Among the poor, midwives often worked for minimal payment or in exchange for goods and services. Some midwives supplemented their income by providing other health services or by selling herbal remedies. The birthing chamber was the midwife's domain, and she controlled every aspect of the environment. She determined who could be present, what preparations were needed, and how the birth would be managed. This authority was both practical and symbolic, representing one of the few areas where women held complete control in medieval society. The rituals and customs surrounding childbirth were elaborate and varied by region and social class. The birthing chamber was often prepared with special linens, herbs, and religious objects. Certain foods might be prepared to strengthen the mother, and specific prayers or charms might be recited to ensure a safe delivery. These rituals served both practical and psychological purposes, providing comfort and structure during a dangerous and unpredictable process. The complications that medieval midwives had to manage were numerous and often life-threatening. Breech births, prolonged labor, excessive bleeding, and infections were all common problems that required skill and experience to handle. The midwife's ability to recognize and respond to these complications often meant the difference between life and death for both mother and child. The pain management techniques available to medieval midwives were limited, but not entirely ineffective. Herbal remedies like willow bark, which contains compounds similar to aspirin, and poppy preparations, which contain opiates, could provide some relief. Massage, positioning, and breathing techniques were also used to help women cope with the pain of labor. The spiritual aspects of medieval childbirth were as important as the physical ones. Midwives often served as spiritual guides, leading prayers and invoking divine protection during labor. They might use religious relics, holy water, or blessed objects to provide comfort and protection. The belief in the power of prayer and divine intervention was a crucial part of the birthing process. The postpartum care provided by medieval midwives extended well beyond the moment of birth. They monitored the mother's recovery, provided advice on nursing and infant care, and often remained involved with the family for weeks or months after delivery. This ongoing relationship was crucial for the health and survival of both mother and child. The knowledge base of medieval midwives included not only childbirth, but also general women's health issues. They provided advice on fertility, contraception, and gynecological problems. This made them important figures in women's lives throughout their reproductive years, not just during pregnancy and childbirth. The legal responsibilities of medieval midwives were significant and sometimes dangerous. They were often required to testify in legal proceedings about the legitimacy of births, the paternity of children, or the circumstances of maternal or infant deaths. This legal role could put them in difficult positions, particularly when powerful families or political interests were involved. The decline of traditional midwifery came gradually, as male physicians began to assert control over childbirth, and as formal medical training became more standardized. However, the transition was slow and uneven, and many of the practices and knowledge developed by medieval midwives continued to influence childbirth care for centuries. Medieval childbirth was a life-or-death gamble that women faced with a mixture of hope, fear, and resignation. The statistics were sobering. Maternal mortality rates were estimated at 1 to 3% per birth, which meant that a woman who had multiple children faced a significant cumulative risk of death. Infant mortality was even higher, with perhaps 20 to 30% of children dying before their first birthday. These numbers weren't just statistics. They were the harsh reality that shaped every aspect of medieval reproductive life. The physical dangers of medieval childbirth were numerous and often fatal. Prolonged labor could exhaust both mother and child, leading to death from complications or infection. Breech presentations and other abnormal positions were extremely dangerous without modern surgical techniques. Excessive bleeding during or after delivery was often impossible to control with medieval medical knowledge and tools. The lack of understanding about infection and sterile technique meant that many women who survived the actual birth process died from puerperal fever and other infections in the days and weeks following delivery. The birthing environment, while carefully prepared according to medieval standards, was far from sterile by modern measures. The hands and instruments of attendants, the linens and clothing used, and the general environment all posed infection risks. The pain of medieval childbirth was managed through a combination of herbal remedies, physical techniques, and spiritual practices. But effective pain relief was limited. Women were expected to endure labor with fortitude and faith, viewing their suffering as part of the divine plan and a consequence of Eve's sin. The ability to bear pain gracefully was seen as a virtue, and excessive complaints might be viewed as weakness or lack of faith. The duration of medieval labor was often extended by the lack of medical intervention. Without the ability to perform cesarean sections, use forceps, or provide other surgical assistance, women might labor for days with little relief. The exhaustion and dehydration that resulted from prolonged labor created additional risks for both mother and child. The social pressure surrounding childbirth was intense and could add psychological stress to an already dangerous situation. Women were expected to produce healthy children, particularly male heirs, and failure to do so could have serious consequences for their marriages and social standing. The fear of disappointing family and community expectations added another layer of anxiety to an already stressful experience. The seasonal timing of births could affect outcomes significantly. Babies born during winter months faced additional challenges from cold temperatures and limited food supplies. Summer births might be complicated by heat and the increased risk of infection. The agricultural calendar also influenced the availability of assistance, as family members might be occupied with crucial farm work during certain times of the year. The age of the mother was a significant factor in medieval childbirth outcomes. Very young mothers who might be married and pregnant in their early teens faced higher risks due to their physical immaturity. Older mothers, particularly those over 35, also faced increased dangers. The ideal childbearing age was considered to be the late teens and 20s, but social and economic factors often prevented women from having control over the timing of their pregnancies. The number of previous births affected both the risks and the experience of medieval childbirth. First-time mothers faced the highest risks, as their bodies had not yet adapted to the birthing process. However, women who had many children also faced increased dangers from the cumulative effects of multiple pregnancies and the physical toll of repeated childbearing. The nutritional status of medieval women significantly affected their ability to survive childbirth. Poor nutrition during pregnancy could lead to complications such as anemia, which increased the risk of death from bleeding. The limited understanding of prenatal nutrition meant that many women entered labor in a weakened state that made survival less likely. The emotional and psychological preparation for medieval childbirth often included preparation for death. Women commonly made wills, confessed their sins, and made peace with family members before going into labor. This preparation was both practical and spiritual, acknowledging the very real possibility that they might not survive the experience. The support systems available to medieval women during childbirth varied dramatically based on social class and family circumstances. Wealthy women might have access to skilled midwives, comfortable birthing chambers, and extensive family support. Poor women might have only the assistance of female relatives or neighbors with limited experience and resources. The religious aspects of medieval childbirth were central to the experience. Women prayed for divine protection, made vows and offerings, and often had religious relics or blessed objects present during labor. The belief in divine intervention was both a source of comfort and a way of coping with the lack of effective medical treatment. The aftermath of difficult or unsuccessful births could have long-lasting consequences for families and communities. The death of a mother left children without care and husbands without partners, often creating economic and social hardship. The death of infants was common but still emotionally devastating, and families had to find ways to cope with frequent losses while continuing to hope for successful pregnancies. Medieval sexuality wasn't just about personal relationships and individual desires. It was deeply embedded in economic systems that governed everything from marriage negotiations to inheritance laws. The bedroom, far from being a private space removed from commercial concerns, was actually one of the most economically significant locations in medieval society, where decisions made in intimate moments could affect the financial fortunes of entire families for generations. The dowry system was perhaps the most obvious way that sexuality and economics intersected in medieval life. A woman's virginity and reproductive potential were literally priced and negotiated as part of marriage contracts. The size of a dowry often reflected not just a family's wealth, but also their assessment of their daughter's marriage ability, which included her beauty, health, fertility, and moral reputation. A woman who lost her virginity before marriage might see her dowry reduced or her marriage prospects severely damaged. The economic value of children, particularly male heirs, created enormous pressure on medieval couples to produce offspring. The ability to have children wasn't just a personal desire, it was an economic necessity that affected property inheritance, family alliances, and social status. Women who failed to produce children, especially sons, might find themselves divorced, abandoned, or relegated to secondary status within their own households. The cost of maintaining medieval sexual relationships was significant and often overlooked. The clothing, cosmetics, and grooming required to remain attractive to a spouse represented a substantial ongoing expense. The medical care associated with pregnancy and childbirth could bankrupt families, particularly when complications arose that required expensive treatments or extended care. The regulation of sexuality by medieval authorities was often motivated by economic rather than moral concerns. Prostitution was tolerated and regulated in many cities because it generated tax revenue and supported local businesses. Adultery was punished not just because it was sinful, but because it threatened property rights and inheritance laws. Illegitimate children posed economic problems for families and communities, leading to strict controls on sexual behavior outside marriage. The seasonal patterns of medieval sexuality were closely tied to economic cycles. Marriages were typically scheduled around agricultural calendars, with most weddings taking place after harvest, when families had the resources to pay for celebrations and dowries. The timing of pregnancies was also influenced by economic factors, as families tried to avoid having babies during the most difficult economic periods of the year. The class differences in medieval sexual practices often reflected economic realities rather than moral choices. Wealthy families could afford to maintain strict standards of sexual behavior because they had the resources to supervise their children and arrange advantageous marriages. Poor families, struggling for survival, might be more flexible about sexual norms if it meant economic advantage or simply getting by. The international trade in sexual services and marriage partners was a significant part of the medieval economy. Wealthy men might import wives from distant regions, paying substantial sums for women with particular qualities or connections. The trafficking of women for sexual purposes, while morally condemned, was economically profitable and difficult to eliminate entirely. The insurance aspects of medieval sexuality were crucial for family financial planning. Having multiple children was partly an insurance policy against high infant mortality rates. Families needed several children to ensure that at least some would survive to adulthood and be able to support their parents in old age. The economic value of children as future workers and caregivers influenced decisions about family size and spacing of pregnancies. The professional aspects of medieval sexuality created entire industries and occupations. Matchmakers, marriage brokers, and professional go-betweens earned their living by facilitating romantic and sexual relationships. Midwives, wet nurses, and childcare providers were essential workers whose services were in constant demand. Even the production of contraceptives and aphrodisiacs supported specialized craftspeople and merchants. The legal costs associated with medieval sexuality could be enormous. Disputes over dowries, inheritance rights, paternity, and sexual misconduct often required expensive legal proceedings that could drag on for years. The need to prove virginity, legitimacy, or sexual fidelity might require witness testimony, physical examinations, and other costly procedures. The investment aspects of medieval sexuality were complex and long-term. Families invested heavily in their children's sexual and romantic prospects, paying for education, clothing, and social opportunities that would make them attractive marriage partners. These investments might not pay off for years or decades, but they were essential for maintaining and improving family social and economic status. The risk management aspects of medieval sexuality required careful planning and considerable resources. Families had to prepare for the possibility of difficult pregnancies, infant mortality, and maternal death. They needed to have backup plans for inheritance and succession, and they had to maintain relationships with multiple potential marriage partners to ensure advantageous matches for their children. The taxation of medieval sexuality was both direct and indirect. Governments taxed marriage licenses, inheritance transfers, and commercial sexual services. They also benefited from the economic activity generated by weddings, celebrations, and the various industries that supported romantic and sexual relationships. The regulation and taxation of sexuality was thus an important source of government revenue. The insurance and mutual aid aspects of medieval sexuality were crucial for community survival. Extended families and communities often pooled resources to support members through pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing. These informal insurance systems helped spread the economic risks of reproduction across larger groups, making it possible for individuals to take the risks necessary for family formation and continuation. Medieval lovers didn't just whisper sweet nothings. They whispered sweet somethings that were carefully coded, socially acceptable, and often completely incomprehensible to modern ears. The language of medieval romance was a complex system of symbols, metaphors, and euphemisms that allowed people to express desire and affection while navigating the strict social and religious constraints of their time. The vocabulary of medieval love was heavily influenced by religious language, which created some interesting complications. Lovers borrowed terms from Christian devotion to describe their earthly passions, leading to poetry that could be interpreted as either romantic or spiritual, sometimes both simultaneously. A knight might describe his lady as his salvation or his divine light. language that was both romantically charged and religiously appropriate. The courtly love tradition, popularized by troubadours and poets, created an elaborate code of romantic expression that emphasized suffering, devotion, and unattainable desire. This literary tradition influenced how real people thought about and expressed their romantic feelings, though the reality was often quite different from the idealized poetry. The language of courtly love was deliberately artificial and elevated, designed to transform base physical desire into something noble and spiritual. The use of flower symbolism in medieval love language was extensive and sophisticated. Different flowers carried specific meanings that allowed lovers to communicate complex messages through seemingly innocent gifts or references. Roses symbolized passion and beauty, but the color mattered. Red roses meant passionate love, white roses meant pure love, and pink roses meant gentle affection. Violets represented faithfulness, while forget-me-nots meant true love and remembrance. The animal symbolism used in medieval love poetry was equally complex and meaningful. Lovers might compare themselves to various animals to convey different aspects of their feelings or situations. The hart, deer, represented the pursued lover, while the hunter represented the pursuer. Birds were often used to symbolize the soul or the beloved, with different species carrying different meanings. The nightingale represented the lover's song, while the dove symbolized purity and peace. The seasonal metaphors in medieval love language reflected the agricultural rhythms that dominated medieval life. Spring represented new love and awakening desire, while winter symbolized separation or the death of love. The harvest season might represent the fulfillment of love, while the planting season could symbolize hope and new beginnings. These metaphors made romantic poetry accessible to audiences whose lives were closely tied to natural cycles. The architectural metaphors used in medieval love poetry reflected the importance of castles, churches, and other buildings in medieval society. The beloved might be described as a fortress to be conquered, a temple to be worshipped, or a garden to be cultivated. These metaphors allowed poets to discuss romantic and sexual relationships in terms that were familiar and socially acceptable. The musical metaphors in medieval love language were particularly rich and complex. Love was often described in terms of harmony, discord, melody, and rhythm. Lovers might be described as instruments that played together in perfect harmony, or as singers whose voices blended beautifully. The language of music provided a way to discuss the emotional and physical aspects of love in terms that were both beautiful and socially acceptable. The medical and alchemical language used in medieval love poetry reflected the period's understanding of the body and emotions. Love was often described as a disease that required treatment, with symptoms like fever, sleeplessness, and loss of appetite. The beloved might be described as the physician who could cure the lover's ailment, or as the medicine that could restore health and happiness. This medical metaphor allowed poets to discuss the physical effects of love in socially acceptable terms. The religious pilgrimage metaphors were particularly popular in medieval love poetry. The lover might describe himself as a pilgrim seeking the shrine of his beloved, with the journey representing the trials and tribulations of courtship. The beloved became a sacred destination, worthy of devotion and sacrifice. This metaphor allowed poets to elevate romantic love to a spiritual level while maintaining religious respectability. The feudal and chivalric language of medieval love reflected the social and political structures of the time. Lovers often used the vocabulary of feudalism to describe their relationships, with the beloved as the lord or lady and the lover as the faithful vassal. This created a framework for discussing power dynamics, loyalty, and service within romantic relationships while using familiar social concepts. The coded language of medieval love letters was necessarily subtle and indirect. Lovers had to communicate their feelings while being aware that their correspondence might be intercepted and read by family members, religious authorities, or political enemies. This led to the development of elaborate systems of coded language, hidden meanings, and symbolic references that could convey intimate messages while maintaining plausible deniability. The regional variations in medieval love language reflected local customs, dialects, and cultural influences. The troubadour tradition of southern France developed different conventions from the minnesingers of Germany or the courtly poets of England. These regional differences created rich varieties of romantic expression while maintaining common themes and structures across medieval Europe. The class distinctions in medieval love language were significant and carefully maintained. The elaborate, educated language of courtly love was primarily the domain of the nobility and educated classes. Common people developed their own forms of romantic expression that were more direct and practical, though they were often influenced by the literary traditions of their social superiors. The gender differences in medieval love language were pronounced and reflected the social expectations of the time. Men were expected to be the active pursuers, using language of conquest, service, and devotion. Women were expected to be more passive and modest in their expression, though they developed their own subtle ways of communicating interest and affection within the constraints of social propriety. The evolution of medieval love language over time reflected changing social, religious, and cultural conditions. The early medieval period emphasized duty and practical considerations, while the later medieval period saw the development of more elaborate and emotional forms of romantic expression. The influence of classical literature, religious mysticism, and emerging humanistic ideas all contributed to this evolution. The translation and transmission of medieval love language across linguistic and cultural boundaries created interesting hybrid forms of romantic expression. As ideas and literary forms moved between different regions and languages, they were adapted and modified to fit local conditions and preferences. This process of cultural exchange enriched the vocabulary and imagery available to medieval lovers. The performance aspects of medieval love language were crucial to its effectiveness. Much romantic poetry was meant to be sung, recited, or performed rather than simply read, silently. The musical and theatrical elements of romantic expression added layers of meaning and emotional impact that enhanced the basic linguistic content. The preservation and documentation of medieval love language in manuscripts, letters, and literary works provides modern scholars with insights into the emotional lives of medieval people. However, the formal and literary nature of much of this preserved language means that the everyday expressions of love used by ordinary people are often lost to history. Medieval Europe was a society obsessed with categorizing, regulating, and often condemning various forms of sexual expression. The church, secular authorities, and social conventions created an elaborate system of sexual taboos that governed everything from acceptable positions for married couples to the severe punishment of behaviors deemed unnatural or sinful. Understanding these taboos provides insight into the complex relationship between desire, morality, and power in medieval society. The concept of natural versus unnatural sexual behavior was central to medieval thinking about sexuality. The church taught that sexual activity had one primary purpose, procreation, and any sexual behavior that could not result in pregnancy was considered unnatural and sinful. This included not only homosexual activity, but also certain heterosexual practices, masturbation, and even excessive pleasure within marriage. The punishment for sexual taboos varied dramatically depending on the specific act, the social status of the individuals involved, and the jurisdiction where the offense occurred. Some sexual crimes were punishable by death, while others might result in public penance, fines, or temporary exile. The inconsistency in punishment often reflected the practical difficulties of enforcing sexual morality rather than clear legal principles. The documentation of sexual taboos in medieval legal and religious texts provides a fascinating glimpse into the sexual behaviors that medieval people actually engaged in, despite official disapproval. The very existence of detailed prohibitions and punishments suggests that these behaviors were common enough to require regulation, even if they were officially condemned. The gender differences in sexual taboos were pronounced and reflected broader patterns of gender inequality in medieval society. Women faced more severe consequences for sexual transgressions than men, and their sexual behavior was more closely monitored and controlled. The concept of female honor was closely tied to sexual purity, while male honor was more connected to other forms of behavior and achievement. The class distinctions in the enforcement of sexual taboos were significant and often hypocritical. Wealthy and powerful individuals might escape punishment for sexual behaviors that would result in severe consequences for common people. The ability to pay fines, seek sanctuary, or influence legal proceedings meant that sexual taboos were often more strictly enforced against the poor and powerless. The regional variations in sexual taboos reflected local customs, religious influences, and political conditions. Some regions were more tolerant of certain behaviors, while others maintained strict enforcement of sexual regulations. These variations created a patchwork of sexual norms across medieval Europe that could be confusing and dangerous for travelers and migrants. The seasonal and temporal aspects of sexual taboos added another layer of complexity to medieval sexual regulation. Certain times of the year, days of the week, and religious observances carried additional restrictions on sexual behavior. The church calendar created a complex schedule of permitted and forbidden times for sexual activity that was difficult for ordinary people to follow consistently. The medical and scientific understanding of sexuality in medieval times was limited and often incorrect, but it still influenced the development of sexual taboos. Medieval physicians and scholars developed theories about sexual behavior based on classical sources, religious teachings, and limited observation. These theories often reinforced existing taboos, while creating new ones based on supposed health risks or moral dangers. The enforcement mechanisms for sexual taboos included both formal legal procedures and informal social controls. Church courts, secular courts, and community pressure all played roles in identifying and punishing sexual transgressions. The threat of social ostracism, economic boycott, or physical violence could be as effective as formal legal punishment in enforcing sexual norms. The resistance to sexual taboos took many forms, from open defiance to subtle subversion. Some individuals and communities found ways to work around or ignore sexual restrictions, while others challenged them directly through their behavior or writings. The persistence of prohibited sexual behaviors despite severe punishments suggests that human sexuality was not easily controlled by legal or religious authority. The psychological impact of sexual taboos on medieval people was significant but difficult to document. The constant awareness of sexual restrictions and the fear of punishment for natural desires created stress, guilt, and anxiety that affected many aspects of life. The internalization of sexual shame and the suppression of natural impulses had long-term consequences for individual and social well-being. The economic aspects of sexual taboos included both the costs of enforcement and the profits that could be made from sexual regulation. Courts collected fines from sexual offenders. The church benefited from the penance and donations of guilty parties, and various officials profited from their roles in sexual regulation. The economic incentives for maintaining sexual taboos sometimes conflicted with the stated moral purposes of these restrictions. The international and cross-cultural aspects of medieval sexual taboos reflected the exchange of ideas and practices between different societies. The influence of Islamic, Jewish, and classical sources on Christian sexual morality created complex hybrid systems of sexual regulation that varied across time and place. The contact between different cultures through trade, war, and diplomacy also influenced the development and enforcement of sexual taboos. The legacy of medieval sexual taboos extended far beyond the medieval period itself, influencing attitudes toward sexuality in later centuries and even into the modern era. Many contemporary sexual norms and restrictions can be traced back to medieval origins, though they have been modified and reinterpreted over time. Understanding the historical development of sexual taboos provides insight into the ongoing relationship between sexuality, morality, and social control. In a world where sexual performance was tied to everything from marital happiness to political alliances, medieval people developed an extensive and often dangerous pharmacopoeia of substances believed to enhance desire, improve performance, and increase fertility. The medieval aphrodisiac trade was a thriving underground economy that combined legitimate medical practice with superstition, fraud, and occasionally accidental poisoning. The theoretical basis for medieval aphrodisiacs was rooted in the medical theories of the time, particularly the concept of the four humors and the doctrine of signatures. According to these theories, sexual desire and performance were affected by the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities in the body. Substances that were considered hot and moist were thought to increase sexual desire, while cold and dry substances were believed to diminish it. The doctrine of signatures suggested that the appearance of a substance indicated its medicinal properties. This led to the use of various foods and herbs that resembled sexual organs or suggested fertility and potency. Asparagus, carrots, figs, and oysters were all considered aphrodisiacs, partly because of their suggestive shapes or textures, though some of these foods may have had actual nutritional benefits that supported sexual health. The exotic nature of many medieval aphrodisiacs reflected the international trade networks that brought rare and expensive substances to European markets. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cardamom were prized not only for their flavor, but also for their supposed aphrodisiac properties. The high cost of these substances made them status symbols as well as sexual enhancers, creating a market for both genuine and counterfeit products. The animal-based aphrodisiacs used in medieval times were often the most expensive and sought after, though they were also the most dangerous. Rhinoceros horn, tiger penis, and various other exotic animal parts were believed to transfer the sexual potency of these animals to human consumers. The trade in these substances was lucrative, but also contributed to the hunting and extinction of various species. The preparation and administration of medieval aphrodisiacs was often as important as the ingredients themselves. Many substances required complex preparation involving specific timing, temperatures, and combinations with other ingredients. The knowledge of how to prepare these substances was closely guarded by practitioners who could charge high fees for their expertise. The gender differences in medieval aphrodisiac use reflected broader patterns of sexual expectations and responsibilities. Men were expected to be sexually active and potent, leading to a large market for male aphrodisiacs. Women were expected to be receptive and fertile, creating demand for substances that were believed to increase female desire and improve fertility. However, women who were too sexually active might be viewed with suspicion, creating a complex market for female aphrodisiacs. The religious and moral implications of aphrodisiac use were complex and often contradictory. While the Church generally disapproved of artificial enhancement of sexual desire, it also recognized the importance of marital fertility and the dangers of sexual dysfunction within marriage. This created a gray area where some aphrodisiac use might be tolerated or even encouraged, while other uses were condemned as sinful or unnatural. The medical profession's relationship with aphrodisiacs was similarly complex. Trained physicians might prescribe certain substances for sexual dysfunction or infertility, while condemning the use of others as dangerous or ineffective. The line between legitimate medical treatment and quackery was often unclear, and many practitioners operated in the borderland between medicine and magic. The social and economic factors that drove the medieval aphrodisiac trade were significant and far-reaching. The pressure to produce heirs, maintain sexual relationships, and demonstrate virility created a large and consistent market for these substances. The high prices that could be charged for effective, or supposedly effective, aphrodisiacs made this a lucrative business for those willing to take the risks involved. The dangers associated with medieval aphrodisiacs were considerable and often underestimated by users. Many substances were toxic in large doses or when combined with other ingredients. The lack of standardization and quality control meant that users never knew exactly what they were consuming or in what quantities. Deaths from aphrodisiac poisoning were probably more common than historical records suggest. The psychological aspects of medieval aphrodisiac use were as important as the physical effects. The belief that a substance would enhance sexual performance could create a placebo effect that actually improved function, regardless of the substance's actual properties. This psychological component made it difficult to evaluate the true effectiveness of different aphrodisiacs and contributed to the persistence of ineffective treatments. The cultural and literary representations of aphrodisiacs in medieval literature and art provide insights into popular attitudes toward these substances. Love potions and magical elixirs appear frequently in medieval romances and folk tales, suggesting that the use of aphrodisiacs was widely known and accepted, even if it was not always approved of by authorities. The international exchange of aphrodisiac knowledge and substances was facilitated by trade networks, diplomatic contacts, and cultural exchange. Different regions developed their own traditions of aphrodisiac use, and these traditions were shared and modified as they spread across Europe and beyond. This exchange contributed to the development of increasingly complex and sophisticated aphrodisiac preparations. The decline of traditional aphrodisiac use came gradually, as medical knowledge improved and the dangers of many traditional substances became better understood. However, the transition was slow and uneven, and many traditional aphrodisiacs continued to be used well into the modern period. The legacy of medieval aphrodisiac use can still be seen in contemporary alternative medicine and folk remedies. In medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just a personal state, it was a political commodity, a social currency, and occasionally a weapon of mass destruction. The concept of virginity, particularly female virginity, was so central to medieval society that it influenced everything from international diplomacy to local gossip, from religious doctrine to economic transactions. Understanding the politics of medieval virginity reveals the complex ways that sexuality, power, and social control intersected in medieval life. The economic value of virginity in medieval society was explicit and carefully calculated. A virgin bride commanded a higher dowry and better marriage prospects than a non-virgin, creating a direct financial incentive for families to guard their daughter's chastity. The loss of virginity before marriage could result in reduced dowries, broken engagements, and social disgrace that affected entire families. This economic dimension made virginity a family asset that required careful protection and management. The verification of virginity was a complex and often traumatic process that involved physical examination, witness testimony, and sometimes legal proceedings. Midwives and other female experts were called upon to examine brides and provide testimony about their virginal status. These examinations were invasive, unreliable, and often based on incorrect medical understanding, but they carried enormous social and legal weight. The religious significance of virginity in medieval Christianity elevated it from a social preference to a divine mandate. The Virgin Mary served as the ultimate model of female purity, and virginity was seen as a state of spiritual perfection that brought individuals closer to God. This religious dimension gave virginity a sacred quality that made its loss not just a social transgression, but a spiritual failing. The gender double standard surrounding virginity was pronounced and deeply embedded in medieval culture. While female virginity was highly prized and carefully guarded, male virginity was less important and sometimes even viewed as a sign of weakness or lack of masculinity. This double standard reflected broader patterns of gender inequality and the different expectations placed on men and women in medieval society. The legal implications of virginity were extensive and affected many aspects of medieval law. Marriage contracts often included specific provisions about virginity, and the discovery of non-virginity could void marriages or result in legal penalties. Rape laws were often more concerned with the loss of virginity than with the violence of the act itself, treating rape primarily as a property crime against the woman's family rather than a personal assault. The social rituals surrounding the preservation and loss of virginity were elaborate and public. Wedding ceremonies included various customs designed to demonstrate and celebrate the bride's virginity, while the wedding night was often subject to scrutiny and verification by family members and community representatives. These rituals reinforced the social importance of virginity while creating additional pressure and anxiety for young women. The medical understanding of virginity in medieval times was limited and often incorrect, but it still influenced social practices and legal procedures. The concept of the hymen as proof of virginity was not well understood, and many other physical signs were incorrectly interpreted as evidence of sexual activity. This medical ignorance led to false accusations, unjust punishments, and considerable suffering for women who were incorrectly judged to be non-virgins. The class distinctions in the treatment of virginity reflected broader patterns of social inequality in medieval society. Noble women faced more scrutiny and higher expectations regarding their virginity, but they also had more resources to protect and verify their status. Common women might face less formal oversight, but they also had fewer protections against false accusations or social consequences. The international and diplomatic aspects of virginity were significant in medieval politics. Royal marriages were often negotiated based partly on the virginity and fertility of potential brides, and the verification of a princess's virginity might be a matter of international concern. The loss of virginity by a royal woman could have diplomatic consequences that affected relations between kingdoms. The resistance to virginity requirements took various forms, from individual acts of defiance to broader social movements that challenged traditional expectations. Some women found ways to conceal the loss of their virginity, while others openly challenged the social importance placed on this physical state. These acts of resistance were often dangerous and could result in severe social and legal consequences, but they also demonstrated the agency and determination of women who refused to be defined solely by their sexual status. The psychological impact of virginity requirements on medieval women was profound and often damaging. The constant pressure to maintain and prove their virginity created anxiety, fear, and shame that could affect women throughout their lives. The emphasis on virginity as the primary measure of female worth made it difficult for women to develop other sources of self-esteem and identity. The commercial aspects of virginity created markets for various services and products related to its preservation and verification. Merchants sold chastity belts, protective amulets, and other items supposedly designed to preserve virginity. Medical practitioners offered examinations and treatments related to virginity, while legal experts specialized in virginity-related disputes and proceedings. The seasonal and temporal aspects of virginity politics were influenced by religious calendars, agricultural cycles, and social customs. Certain times of the year were considered more appropriate for marriages and the loss of virginity, while other periods were associated with increased vigilance and protection. These temporal patterns created rhythms of tension and release around virginity-related concerns. The regional variations in virginity politics reflected local customs, religious influences, and cultural traditions. Some regions maintained stricter requirements and more elaborate verification procedures, while others were more relaxed about virginity-related matters. These variations created different experiences for women depending on where they lived and the specific customs of their communities. The technological and medical developments that affected virginity politics included improvements in medical knowledge, surgical techniques, and methods of verification. As understanding of female anatomy improved, some of the traditional methods of virginity verification were recognized as unreliable, though social practices were slow to change in response to new knowledge. The literary and artistic representations of virginity in medieval culture provide insights into popular attitudes and concerns about this issue. Stories of virgin martyrs, tales of lost and recovered virginity, and artistic depictions of pure and impure women all reflected and reinforced social attitudes about the importance of female chastity. The decline of extreme virginity politics came gradually, as changing social conditions, improved medical knowledge, and evolving religious attitudes reduced the emphasis on female virginity as the primary measure of worth. However, the transition was slow and uneven, and many aspects of virginity politics persisted well into the modern period. While the Church preached that sexual activity should be solely for procreation, the reality of medieval life created a thriving underground market for contraceptive knowledge, devices, and substances. This shadow economy operated in the margins of medieval society, serving everyone from desperate peasant women to noble ladies who needed to space their pregnancies for health or political reasons. The world of medieval contraception was dangerous, unreliable, and often illegal, but it was also innovative, persistent, and surprisingly widespread. The herbal contraceptives used in medieval times represented centuries of accumulated folk knowledge passed down through networks of women who shared information about reproductive control. Plants like pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and savin were commonly used as abortifacients and contraceptives, often prepared as teas, pessaries, or topical applications. While some of these herbs did have contraceptive properties, they were also highly toxic and could cause serious illness or death when used incorrectly. The preparation and distribution of contraceptive herbs was typically controlled by older women who had learned the knowledge through experience and apprenticeship. These informal practitioners, sometimes called wise women or cunning women, served as the primary source of reproductive health information for their communities. Their knowledge was passed down orally and varied significantly from region to region, creating a patchwork of contraceptive practices across medieval Europe. The barrier methods used in medieval contraception were primitive but sometimes effective. Pessaries made from various materials including wool, cotton, and even crocodile dung were inserted into the vagina to block conception. Some women used sponges soaked in acidic substances like vinegar or lemon juice, which could provide some contraceptive protection. These methods required knowledge, preparation, and often considerable discomfort, but they offered women some degree of control over their reproductive lives. The timing methods employed by medieval women were based on incomplete understanding of the female reproductive cycle, but they represented attempts to use natural family planning techniques. Some women tried to track their menstrual cycles and avoid intercourse during what they believed were fertile periods. However, the lack of accurate knowledge about ovulation made these methods largely ineffective, though they demonstrated women's desire to control their fertility. The male methods of contraception were limited, but not entirely absent from medieval practice. Withdrawal, or coitus interruptus, was probably the most common male-controlled method, though it required considerable self-control and cooperation. Some men used primitive condoms made from animal intestines or bladders, though these were expensive, unreliable, and often uncomfortable. The burden of contraception typically fell on women, who faced the greatest consequences if methods failed. The magical and superstitious aspects of medieval contraception were extensive and reflected the limited scientific understanding of reproduction. Amulets, charms, and rituals were commonly used alongside or instead of physical methods. Women might wear specific stones or metals, recite particular prayers, or perform elaborate rituals believed to prevent conception. While these methods had no actual contraceptive effect, they provided psychological comfort and a sense of control over reproduction. The social networks that supported contraceptive knowledge were informal but crucial for the transmission of information. Women shared knowledge through family connections, neighborhood relationships, and occupational associations. Midwives, healers, and other women with medical knowledge often served as sources of contraceptive information, though they had to be careful about how openly they shared such knowledge. The economic factors that drove contraceptive use were significant and often desperate. Large families were expensive to maintain, and in times of scarcity, additional children could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The economic pressure to limit family size often outweighed religious prohibitions and social disapproval, leading many couples to take risks with dangerous contraceptive methods. The legal and religious dangers associated with contraceptive use were considerable and created a climate of secrecy and fear around reproductive control. The Church condemned contraception as sinful and unnatural, while secular authorities often treated it as a form of murder or witchcraft. Women who were known to use contraceptives might face accusations of sorcery, moral corruption, or heresy, with potentially fatal consequences. The international trade in contraceptive ingredients created networks of knowledge and materials that spanned medieval Europe and beyond. Exotic herbs and substances were imported from distant regions, often at great expense, based on their reputation for preventing pregnancy. This trade also facilitated the exchange of contraceptive knowledge between different cultures and medical traditions. The failure rates of medieval contraceptive methods were high, leading to frequent unintended pregnancies and the need for alternative solutions. When contraception failed, women faced difficult choices about whether to continue the pregnancy, seek abortion, which was dangerous and often illegal, or arrange hasty marriages to legitimize the birth. These failures created additional demand for contraceptive knowledge and methods. The documentation of medieval contraceptive practices is limited because these activities were often conducted in secret and rarely recorded in official documents. Most of our knowledge comes from medical texts, religious condemnations, legal records of prosecutions, and occasional references in literature and personal correspondence. This limited documentation may not accurately represent the full range of practices used by ordinary people. The psychological impact of contraceptive use in medieval times was complex and often contradictory. Women knew that their contraceptive practices were risky and often condemned by authorities, but they also felt that they were necessary for survival and family welfare. This created cognitive dissonance that was resolved by emphasizing the practical benefits while minimizing the moral and physical risks. The technological limitations of medieval contraceptive production meant that even well-intentioned practitioners couldn't produce consistently safe or effective products. The lack of understanding about reproductive biology, chemical interactions, and dose-response relationships made it impossible to create reliable contraceptive preparations, even when using potentially effective ingredients. The decline of traditional medieval contraceptive practices came gradually, as medical knowledge improved and safer, more effective methods became available. However, the transition was slow and uneven, and many traditional practices persisted well into the modern period. The legacy of medieval contraceptive knowledge can still be seen in various folk remedies and alternative medicine practices that continue to be used in some parts of the world. The wedding night in medieval Europe was far from the private, romantic affair that modern couples might expect. Instead, it was a highly ritualized, often public event that served legal, social, and religious purposes beyond the personal desires of the bride and groom. The consummation of marriage was considered so important that it was often witnessed, verified, and documented in ways that would seem intrusive and bizarre to contemporary sensibilities. The legal importance of consummation in medieval marriage law cannot be overstated. A marriage was not considered fully valid until it had been consummated, and the failure to consummate could be grounds for annulment. This legal requirement meant that the wedding night was not just a personal milestone, but a crucial legal event that could affect inheritance rights, political alliances, and family honor. The pressure to successfully consummate the marriage created anxiety and performance expectations that could be overwhelming for young couples. The preparation for the wedding night began long before the actual ceremony and involved both practical and ritual elements. The bride and groom might receive instruction from family members, clergy, or experienced married couples about what to expect and how to behave. Special foods, drinks, and herbal preparations were often provided to enhance fertility, reduce anxiety, or improve performance. The wedding chamber was carefully prepared with blessed linens, religious objects, and sometimes aphrodisiac substances. The blessing of the marriage bed was a common ritual that involved clergy or family elders consecrating the space where consummation would take place. This blessing was intended to ensure divine protection and favor for the couple's intimate relationship and future fertility. The bed might be sprinkled with holy water, decorated with religious symbols, or blessed with special prayers designed to promote marital harmony and successful procreation. The witnessing of consummation was a practice that varied by region and social class, but was surprisingly common throughout medieval Europe. In some cases, family members or official witnesses would remain in the room during the consummation, while in others they might wait outside and enter afterward to verify that the act had taken place. The purpose of this witnessing was to provide legal proof that the marriage had been properly consummated and to prevent later disputes about the validity of the union. The physical evidence of consummation was often required and carefully preserved as legal documentation. The blood-stained sheets from the wedding night were commonly displayed or preserved as proof of the bride's virginity and the successful consummation of the marriage. This practice was particularly important for noble families, where the legitimacy of future heirs might depend on proving that the marriage had been properly consummated. The timing of consummation was often carefully calculated based on religious calendars, astrological considerations, and practical concerns. Some couples were advised to wait for auspicious dates or times, while others were encouraged to consummate immediately to ensure the legal validity of their union. The Church's restrictions on sexual activity during certain periods could complicate the timing of consummation and create additional stress for newlyweds. The role of alcohol and other substances in wedding night rituals was significant and often problematic. Wine, ale, and other alcoholic beverages were commonly provided to reduce anxiety and inhibitions, but excessive consumption could interfere with successful consummation. Herbal preparations and supposed aphrodisiacs were also used, though their effectiveness was questionable and their safety was often doubtful. The gender expectations surrounding consummation were heavily influenced by medieval ideas about male and female sexuality. Men were expected to be knowledgeable, assertive, and successful in their sexual performance, while women were expected to be passive, modest, and receptive. These expectations created different types of pressure for brides and grooms and could lead to performance anxiety, disappointment, and relationship problems. The age factors in medieval marriage consummation were often problematic by modern standards. Many marriages involved very young participants, sometimes children who were not physically or emotionally ready for sexual activity. The legal and social pressure to consummate these marriages could result in trauma, injury, and long-term psychological damage for young brides and grooms. The medical understanding of consummation in medieval times was limited and often incorrect, but it still influenced practices and expectations. Medieval physicians and scholars had theories about sexual anatomy, fertility, and the mechanics of intercourse that were often based on incomplete or inaccurate information. These theories influenced advice given to newlyweds and could create unrealistic expectations or dangerous practices. The social consequences of failed consummation were severe and could affect entire families and communities. A marriage that could not be consummated might be annulled, creating scandal and potentially disrupting political alliances or economic arrangements. The shame associated with sexual failure could follow individuals throughout their lives and affect their ability to form future relationships. The regional and cultural variations in consummation rituals reflected local customs, religious influences, and social structures. Some regions had elaborate ceremonies and extensive witnessing requirements, while others maintained more private and simple practices. These variations created different experiences for couples depending on where they lived and the specific customs of their communities. The documentation of consummation rituals in medieval records provides insights into the social importance of these practices, but it also reveals the intrusive and often traumatic nature of medieval marriage customs. Legal documents, church records, and personal accounts describe various aspects of consummation rituals, though the private and sensitive nature of these events means that much information has been lost or deliberately concealed. The psychological impact of public consummation rituals on medieval couples was significant but rarely acknowledged at the time. The pressure to perform sexually in front of witnesses or under scrutiny could create lasting trauma and relationship problems. The emphasis on physical proof of consummation could reduce the wedding night from an intimate expression of love to a mechanical legal requirement. The decline of elaborate consummation rituals came gradually, as changing social attitudes, improved understanding of sexuality, and evolving legal requirements reduced the emphasis on public verification of marital consummation. However, the transition was slow and uneven, and some aspects of these rituals persisted well into the early modern period in certain regions and social classes. As we reach the end of our journey through the intimate, complex, and often bewildering world of medieval sexuality, it's worth reflecting on how these ancient practices, beliefs, and attitudes continue to influence our modern understanding of love, relationships, and human sexuality. The medieval period, far from being a time of simple repression or ignorance, was actually an era of remarkable complexity, contradiction, and innovation in sexual matters that laid the groundwork for many contemporary attitudes and practices. The Church's influence on medieval sexuality created patterns of guilt, shame, and regulation that persisted long after the medieval period ended. The association of sexuality with sin, the emphasis on procreation over pleasure, and the detailed regulation of intimate behavior established precedents that influenced Western attitudes toward sexuality for centuries. Even today, many contemporary debates about sexual morality, reproductive rights, and the role of religion in personal relationships can be traced back to medieval origins. The economic dimensions of medieval sexuality, the dowry system, the commodification of virginity, the regulation of prostitution, established patterns of sexual commerce that continue to influence modern relationships. The idea that sexuality has economic value, that reproductive capacity affects social status, and that intimate relationships are subject to market forces all have medieval precedents that persist in various forms today. The gender inequalities that characterized medieval sexuality created lasting patterns of discrimination and double standards that continue to affect contemporary relationships. The different expectations for male and female sexual behavior, the emphasis on female purity and male prowess, and the unequal consequences of sexual transgression all established precedents that influence modern gender relations, though they have been challenged and modified over time. The medical and scientific understanding of sexuality that developed during the medieval period, while often incorrect by modern standards, represented important early attempts to understand human reproductive biology and sexual behavior. The medieval emphasis on the connection between physical health and sexual function, the recognition of sexuality as a legitimate medical concern, and the development of treatments for sexual dysfunction all contributed to the foundation of modern sexual medicine. The literary and artistic traditions that emerged from medieval sexuality, courtly love poetry, romantic literature, and artistic depictions of love and desire, established cultural patterns that continue to influence contemporary expressions of romance and sexuality. The idealization of romantic love, the emphasis on emotional connection in sexual relationships, and the use of symbolic language to express intimate feelings all have medieval origins that persist in modern culture. The legal frameworks that governed medieval sexuality established precedents for the regulation of intimate relationships that continue to influence contemporary law. Marriage law, inheritance rights, reproductive regulations, and the legal treatment of sexual crimes all have medieval origins that have been modified and updated, but not entirely abandoned in modern legal systems. The social rituals and customs surrounding medieval sexuality, courtship practices, wedding ceremonies, and relationship milestones established patterns that continue to influence contemporary social behavior. Many modern wedding traditions, courtship customs, and relationship expectations can be traced back to medieval origins, though they have been adapted to contemporary circumstances and values. The international and cross-cultural exchanges that characterized medieval sexuality created patterns of cultural diffusion and adaptation that continue to influence contemporary global sexual culture. The movement of ideas, practices, and attitudes across cultural boundaries during the medieval period established precedents for the globalization of sexual culture that continues today. The resistance and adaptation that characterized medieval responses to sexual regulation demonstrated human creativity and resilience in the face of restrictive social conditions. The ways that medieval people found to express their sexuality despite official disapproval, to maintain intimate relationships under difficult circumstances, and to adapt to changing social conditions provide models for contemporary efforts to navigate complex sexual and social environments. The technological and medical innovations that emerged from medieval sexuality, contraceptive methods, fertility treatments, and sexual health practices, established foundations for modern reproductive medicine and sexual health care. While medieval methods were often dangerous and ineffective, they represented important early attempts to control reproduction and treat sexual dysfunction that contributed to the development of modern medical practice. The psychological insights that emerged from medieval sexuality, the recognition of the connection between emotional and physical intimacy, the understanding of sexuality as a fundamental human drive, and the awareness of the psychological impact of sexual regulation, contributed to the foundation of modern psychological understanding of human sexuality. The medieval recognition that sexual satisfaction was important for mental and physical health despite official disapproval anticipated many modern insights about the role of sexuality in human well-being. The educational aspects of medieval sexuality, the transmission of sexual knowledge through informal networks, the role of experienced practitioners in teaching younger people, and the development of specialized expertise in sexual matters established patterns of sexual education that continue to influence how people learn about sexuality today. The medieval emphasis on practical knowledge and experiential learning provided models for contemporary approaches to sexual education and counseling. The spiritual and philosophical dimensions of medieval sexuality, the integration of physical and spiritual love, the search for transcendence through intimate relationships, and the exploration of the connection between earthly and divine love contributed to ongoing discussions about the meaning and purpose of human sexuality. The medieval attempt to reconcile physical desire with spiritual aspiration continues to influence contemporary debates about the role of sexuality in human life. The community and social aspects of medieval sexuality, the involvement of extended families and communities in intimate relationships, the collective responsibility for sexual regulation, and the social support for reproductive health, provided models for community involvement in sexual matters that continue to influence contemporary approaches to sexual health and relationship support. The seasonal and cyclical aspects of medieval sexuality, the connection between sexual activity and natural rhythms, the integration of sexuality with agricultural and religious calendars, and the recognition of sexuality as part of larger natural and social cycles, offered perspectives on sexuality that have been largely lost in modern industrial society, but are being rediscovered in contemporary discussions about natural family planning and holistic approaches to sexual health. The artistic and creative expressions of medieval sexuality, the use of symbolism and metaphor to express intimate feelings, the development of romantic literature and poetry, and the creation of visual art that celebrated human love and desire, established traditions of sexual expression that continue to influence contemporary art, literature, and popular culture. The political dimensions of medieval sexuality, the use of sexual regulation as a tool of social control, the connection between sexual behavior and political power, and the role of sexuality in diplomatic and international relations, provided insights into the relationship between sexuality and power that continue to be relevant in contemporary political and social analysis. The environmental and ecological aspects of medieval sexuality, the connection between human reproduction and environmental conditions, the impact of climate and seasons on sexual behavior, and the integration of sexuality with broader ecological systems, offered perspectives on sexuality that are being rediscovered in contemporary discussions about environmental health and sustainable population practices. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval sexuality, improvements in contraceptive methods, developments in fertility treatments, and advances in sexual health care, established foundations for modern reproductive technology that continue to evolve and improve. The medieval willingness to experiment with new methods and technologies, despite risks and social disapproval, provided models for contemporary innovation in sexual and reproductive health. The global and cross-cultural perspectives that emerged from medieval sexuality, the exchange of sexual knowledge and practices between different cultures, the adaptation of sexual customs to local conditions, and the development of hybrid sexual traditions, established patterns of cultural exchange that continue to influence contemporary global sexual culture and the ongoing evolution of sexual norms and practices. As we conclude this exploration of medieval sexuality, it becomes clear that the medieval period was not a time of simple repression or ignorance, but rather a complex era of innovation, adaptation, and human creativity in the face of challenging circumstances. The people of medieval Europe, despite the constraints of their time, found ways to express their sexuality, maintain intimate relationships, and create meaning and beauty in their personal lives. The legacy of medieval sexuality is not just historical curiosity, it is a living influence that continues to shape contemporary attitudes, practices, and debates about human sexuality. Understanding this legacy helps us appreciate both how far we have come in terms of sexual freedom and knowledge, and how much of our contemporary sexual culture is rooted in medieval foundations. The medieval experience also reminds us that sexuality is always embedded in larger social, economic, political, and cultural contexts that shape how people understand and express their intimate desires. The challenges that medieval people faced in navigating these contexts, balancing personal desires with social expectations, managing the risks and benefits of sexual behavior, and finding meaning and connection in intimate relationships, are challenges that continue to face people today, though in different forms and circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience demonstrates the resilience and creativity of human sexuality in the face of regulation, restriction, and social control. Despite the many obstacles they faced, medieval people found ways to love, to connect, and to express their sexuality that were meaningful and fulfilling within the constraints of their time. This resilience and creativity continues to inspire and inform contemporary efforts to create more open, healthy, and fulfilling approaches to human sexuality. The fire crackles softly as our journey through medieval sexuality comes to an end. The shadows of those long-ago lovers, navigating church restrictions, family expectations, and social taboos, fade back into history. But their legacy lives on in every relationship we form, every intimate moment we share, every struggle we face in balancing desire with social expectation. They remind us that sexuality is both deeply personal and profoundly social, both timeless and historically specific, both a source of joy and a site of struggle. In their courage to love despite restrictions, to seek pleasure despite prohibition, and to create intimacy despite surveillance, they showed us that human sexuality cannot be entirely controlled or suppressed. It finds a way to express itself, to create connection, and to bring meaning to human life. And in that persistence, that creativity, that fundamental human drive to connect with others in the most intimate ways possible, perhaps we find the most beautiful and enduring lesson of medieval sexuality, that love, in all its forms, will always find a way. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the intimate world of medieval sexuality. If you enjoyed this exploration of history's most private moments, let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to uncover. Until next time, sleep well and be grateful for modern privacy.